There are stories that become larger than the people at their center. At first, they seem simple. A family living quietly in a remote part of West Virginia. A few videos shared online. Millions of people discovering lives they had never seen before. Then attention grows. Money begins moving. New personalities enter the story. Promises are made. Relationships form. Audiences choose sides. And before long, nobody is arguing about the family anymore. They are arguing about everyone around them. That is where the story stands today. Because after months of silence, one of the central figures connected to the Whittaker controversy has returned to speak publicly. Patrick Rork, whose name has remained attached to the ongoing debate surrounding the family, recently appeared online again and began answering questions. Not all questions, but enough to restart a conversation many people thought had gone quiet. The timing matters. For months, viewers have watched a growing divide emerge between competing versions of the same story. Different people involved have offered different explanations. Supporters have defended their preferred narratives. Critics have challenged nearly every statement that has been made. And through all of it, one question has continued to surface. What really happened? Not what people assume happened. Not what people fear happened. Not what people hope happened. What can actually be established? That question is why Patrick's recent appearance attracted attention. Because regardless of what anyone thinks about him personally, he remains one of the few people who was physically present during many of the events that transformed the Whittaker story from a human interest phenomenon into a public controversy. And when someone connected to a controversy begins speaking again, every word is examined. Every omission is noticed. Every answer creates new questions. One of the first things observers noticed was Patrick's willingness to discuss subjects many assumed he would avoid. For a long time, there had been speculation that legal restrictions prevented him from speaking publicly about certain aspects of the situation. Those assumptions circulated widely across social media communities that continue following developments related to the family. Yet during his appearance, Patrick suggested that the reality was more complicated than many viewers believed. That immediately changed the tone of the discussion. Because if people assumed silence meant someone could not speak, what does it mean when that person begins speaking again? Was the silence strategic? Was it legal advice? Was it personal choice? Or was it simply a period of waiting while larger issues continued unfolding behind the scenes? Those questions remain open. But what became clear is that Patrick wanted to address at least some of the public narratives surrounding him. And that is where the conversation becomes interesting. Not because definitive answers suddenly appeared. They did not. But because the return of one participant inevitably forces people to revisit assumptions they may have accepted months earlier. One of the themes running throughout Patrick's discussion was perception. Specifically, the gap between what audiences believe happened and what participants say actually happened. That gap has existed from the beginning. The Whittaker story has always involved multiple perspectives. Family members had perspectives. Visitors had perspectives. Content creators had perspectives. Supporters had perspectives. Critics had perspectives. Law enforcement had perspectives. Social service agencies had perspectives. And each perspective emphasized different pieces of a very complicated puzzle. The challenge is that audiences rarely see the entire puzzle. They see fragments. A video clip, a live stream, a screenshot, a statement, a response to a statement. And gradually those fragments become someone's version of reality. The problem is that different people receive different fragments, which means different audiences often arrive at completely different conclusions while believing they are looking at the same story. That dynamic has defined nearly every major debate connected to the Whittakers. The issue of fundraising, the issue of housing, the issue of caregiving, the issue of family separation, the issue of outside involvement, the issue of responsibility. Each subject has generated competing interpretations. and each interpretation has attracted its own supporters. What Patrick's return demonstrates is that none of those debates have disappeared. They have simply been waiting for someone to speak, waiting for new information, waiting for a development that might shift public perception. Whether Patrick accomplished that is another question entirely, because speaking publicly does not automatically settle a controversy. Sometimes it deepens it. As viewers began discussing his comments, attention quickly turned toward larger unresolved issues. The biggest issue remains the family itself, not the personalities surrounding them, not the creators, not the commentators, the family. Because while countless arguments continue online, many people remain focused on a far simpler concern. What happened to the Whittakers after the cameras stopped rolling? That question remains emotionally powerful because it cuts through every competing narrative. Regardless of who audiences support or criticize, there is broad agreement on one point. People care about the outcome. They want to know whether family members are safe. They want to know whether they are receiving care. They want to know whether they remain connected to one another. They want to know whether their lives improved. And because detailed public information has been limited, uncertainty has filled the vacuum. Uncertainty almost always creates speculation. Speculation creates rumors. Rumors create competing narratives. And eventually those narratives become difficult to separate from verified facts. That is one reason Patrick's comments attracted attention. Not because he answered everything, but because any first-hand account becomes significant when reliable information is scarce. Still, another important theme emerged from the discussion: trust, or perhaps more accurately, the lack of it. One of the striking realities of the current situation is that trust has become fragmented. Different audiences trust different sources. Some trust Patrick. Some do not. Some trust Eric. Some do not. Some trust independent commentators. Some do not. Some trust official processes. Some do not. The result is a landscape where virtually every statement is immediately challenged. Every claim encounters skepticism. Every explanation is subjected to scrutiny. In one sense, that skepticism is understandable. Major controversies naturally produce questions, especially when vulnerable people are involved. But skepticism can also create an environment where no explanation is ever accepted, where every answer becomes evidence of another hidden agenda, where silence appears suspicious, and speaking appears suspicious too. That is the paradox now facing nearly everyone connected to this story. No matter what they say, somebody believes they are hiding something. And perhaps that is why the controversy continues. Because the story is no longer only about events. It is about interpretation, about credibility, about deciding which sources deserve trust. Patrick's return highlights that reality more clearly than ever. His appearance did not close the book on the Whittaker controversy. If anything, it reminded people that the book remains unfinished. Questions remain. Disagreements remain. Uncertainty remains. And perhaps most importantly, the human consequences remain. Because while audiences debate narratives, real people continue living with the aftermath. The family at the center of this story did not choose to become symbols in a public controversy. Yet that is exactly what happened. Their lives became a battleground for competing explanations. Their circumstances became evidence cited by different sides. Their future became the subject of endless speculation. And now, as voices begin speaking again after long periods of silence, the debate enters another chapter. Not a final chapter, not even a clear chapter, but a chapter that may determine how this story is remembered. Was it ultimately a story about help? A story about mistakes? A story about misunderstanding? A story about exploitation? A story about good intentions colliding with complicated realities? Or was it some combination of all those things? The answer remains unsettled. And that uncertainty may be the most honest place to begin. Because before anyone decides who was right, who was wrong, who deserves criticism, or who deserves credit. There's a more important question waiting underneath all of it. What actually happened behind the public narrative? That is the question Patrick's return has placed back at the center of the conversation. And in the next part, we'll examine the specific claims, responses, and unanswered questions that continue fueling one of the most debated stories connected to the Whittaker family. If Patrick's return accomplished anything, it was this: it forced people to revisit assumptions they had already settled in their minds. For nearly a year, much of the public discussion surrounding the Whittaker controversy operated in an unusual environment. Information moved in fragments. One person would speak while another remained silent. One side would release screenshots while another side would release live streams. Entire theories were built around what was not being said rather than what was. And in situations like that, silence becomes its own form of evidence. People begin assigning meaning to it. If someone stops talking, audiences assume they know why. If someone disappears, audiences assume they know what happened. If someone returns, audiences assume they know the motive. But assumptions have a way of becoming stronger than facts. That is why Patrick's appearance matters even beyond the specific things he discussed. Because his return interrupted a pattern that had been developing for months. Until recently, much of the public conversation was being shaped by people discussing Patrick rather than Patrick discussing himself. That distinction matters. Whenever a controversy develops, there are usually two competing versions of events. The version participants tell, and the version observers construct. Sometimes those versions overlap. Sometimes they are completely different stories. Patrick's recent comments highlighted just how large that gap may have become. One of the recurring themes throughout the discussion involved responsibility. Not legal responsibility. Not necessarily even financial responsibility. Something broader. Moral responsibility. Who bears responsibility for what ultimately happened to the family? That question sits underneath nearly every argument surrounding this story, and it remains unanswered. Some people believe responsibility belongs primarily with those who entered the family's lives and helped turn private circumstances into public content. Others believe responsibility lies with systems that allegedly failed to intervene long before internet attention arrived. Others argue responsibility is shared among multiple individuals whose decisions collectively created the outcome everyone witnessed. The reality is likely more complicated than any single explanation, because major events rarely emerge from one decision. They emerge from a chain of decisions, a sequence of actions, a series of moments where different choices might have produced different outcomes. Looking back, many observers now focus on those moments. The moment cameras arrived, the moment fundraising began, the moment plans expanded, the moment outside agencies became involved, the moment relationships deteriorated, the moment trust collapsed, the moment family members were separated. Each moment appears significant when viewed through hindsight. But hindsight has advantages that people living through events never possess. Hindsight knows how the story ends. The people involved did not. And that reality creates another challenge when evaluating what happened. It is easy to identify mistakes after consequences become visible. It is much harder to identify them while events are still unfolding. That is why debates surrounding the Whittakers remain so intense. People are not merely arguing about actions. They are arguing about intentions. And intentions are notoriously difficult to prove. One person can look at an action and see compassion. Another can look at the exact same action and see opportunism. One person sees help. Another sees interference. One person sees concern. Another sees control. The event itself remains unchanged. Only the interpretation changes. Patrick's comments touched indirectly on that problem, because many of the accusations and defenses surrounding the controversy depend almost entirely on how people interpret motivation. Why did certain people become involved? Why did they remain involved? Why did relationships change? Why did public statements evolve? Why did explanations shift? Those questions continue driving discussion today. Yet another issue raised by Patrick's appearance involves credibility. Over time, every controversy develops credibility battles. People begin ranking sources, trusting some, distrusting others, accepting certain claims, rejecting others. The Whittaker controversy is no exception. In fact, credibility may now be the central issue, because nearly every major question depends on determining which information deserves confidence. Consider how difficult the situation has become. Different participants have provided different explanations. Different commentators have interpreted those explanations differently. Different audiences have embraced different narratives. As a result, viewers are often forced to evaluate not only information itself but the source delivering it. That is an extraordinarily difficult task, especially when emotions become involved. And emotions have always been central to this story. The Whittakers inspired strong emotional reactions from the beginning. Many viewers felt sympathy. Others felt protective. Some felt outrage. Others felt concern. Millions of people looked at the family and experienced something personal. That emotional connection explains why the controversy surrounding them became so intense. People were not debating abstract issues. They were debating people they cared about, people they worried about, people whose futures mattered to them. Once emotional investment exists, every new development carries greater weight. Every unanswered question becomes more frustrating. Every contradiction becomes more suspicious. Every explanation faces greater scrutiny. Patrick's return occurred within that emotional environment, an environment where audiences remain deeply invested in outcomes. And perhaps that is why discussions surrounding his comments quickly expanded beyond what he actually said. Because the controversy is no longer limited to individual statements. It has become symbolic. A larger debate about accountability, about transparency, about vulnerable families, about internet fame, about the responsibilities that come with public attention. One particularly interesting aspect of the current discussion involves the concept of narrative control. Who gets to tell the story? That question may sound simple. It is not. For much of the Whittaker saga, different people effectively competed to define reality. Each participant emphasized different details. Each participant framed events differently. Each participant offered their own interpretation. Audiences then selected whichever version seemed most convincing. The result is a public record filled with competing accounts. That does not necessarily mean someone is lying. Different people can experience the same event differently. Different people can genuinely believe conflicting explanations. Different people can remember situations through entirely different emotional lenses. Yet the existence of multiple narratives creates confusion. And confusion creates opportunity. Opportunity for speculation. Opportunity for assumptions. Opportunity for misinformation. Patrick's appearance demonstrates how difficult it has become to establish a shared understanding of events, even among people following the same story. Another issue gaining attention involves the future, not the past. The future, because despite endless discussion about what happened, many observers remain focused on what comes next. Will additional information emerge? Will official processes produce public conclusions? Will relationships ever be repaired? Will family members reunite? Will questions surrounding money and responsibility ever receive definitive answers? Nobody knows, and that uncertainty fuels ongoing interest. Human beings naturally seek closure. We want stories to resolve. We want mysteries explained. We want clear endings. The Whittaker controversy continues resisting all three. Every time it appears to be ending, another development emerges. Another statement appears. Another allegation surfaces. Another response follows. The cycle begins again. Patrick's return represents another chapter in that cycle. Not necessarily the most important chapter, but an important one nonetheless, because it reminds everyone that the story remains active. The consequences remain real. The questions remain unresolved, and the public remains engaged. Perhaps the most revealing aspect of the entire situation is how little consensus exists even now. People who have followed every development often disagree completely. They disagree about motives. They disagree about facts. They disagree about responsibility. They disagree about solutions. And yet nearly everyone agrees on one point. Something significant happened. Something happened that permanently altered lives. Something happened that transformed a family known primarily within its local community into the center of a national conversation. Something happened that continues generating questions long after many expected the discussion to end. Patrick's recent appearance did not answer all those questions. It may not have answered most of them, but it reminded audiences of something important. The story is still being written. There are still voices speaking. There are still perspectives emerging. There are still pieces of information people believe matter. And as long as that remains true, public interest will continue. Because beneath every accusation, every defense, every theory, and every argument lies the same unresolved issue. People still want to know what really happened. Not what side won. Not who gave the better interview. Not who delivered the strongest defense. What actually happened? That search for clarity is what keeps the story alive. And in the final part, we'll examine the biggest unanswered questions that continue surrounding the Whittaker controversy, why so many observers believe the most important answers have yet to emerge, and why this story may still be far from over. For all the debate, all the live streams, all the accusations, all the defenses, and all the hours of content created around the Whittaker controversy, the most important questions remain the ones nobody can answer with certainty. And perhaps that is why this story refuses to dissipate. Because despite everything that has been said, there is still a remarkable amount that remains unknown. The first unanswered question is also the simplest. What is life actually like for the family today? Not what people assume. Not what supporters claim. Not what critics believe. What is the reality? For months, the public has relied largely on second-hand information. Different people have offered updates. Different commentators have shared what they have heard. Different sources have claimed knowledge of ongoing circumstances. But the people at the center of the story have largely remained out of public view. That absence has created a vacuum. And whenever a vacuum exists, speculation rushes in to fill it. Some believe the family members who were removed are receiving better care than they ever received before. Others believe separation itself created a different kind of hardship. Some argue safety and medical oversight must take priority above everything else. Others argue family bonds cannot simply be replaced by professional care. These are difficult questions because they involve competing values. Safety matters. Independence matters. Medical care matters. Family matters. Human dignity matters. And sometimes those values pull in different directions. The public does not possess enough information to confidently determine how those competing concerns have ultimately been balanced. That uncertainty remains one of the biggest unresolved elements of the entire story. The second major question involves accountability. Not necessarily legal accountability. Broader accountability. What lessons should be learned from everything that happened? Because regardless of where people place blame, the controversy exposed something many viewers had never considered before. What happens when vulnerable people become internet content? That question extends far beyond the Whittakers. The internet has created a world where almost anyone can become famous overnight. A video can spread globally within hours. Millions of strangers can suddenly become invested in someone's life. Money can begin flowing. Opportunities can appear. Attention can multiply. But attention itself does not create structure. Attention does not create safeguards. Attention does not automatically create accountability. Those things must be built. And many observers now look back at the Whittaker story and wonder whether those structures ever truly existed. Who was responsible for oversight? Who was responsible for transparency? Who was responsible for protecting the interests of vulnerable individuals once large audiences became involved? Those questions remain relevant today because similar situations continue emerging across social media platforms every year. The Whittaker controversy became a case study in what can happen when public attention arrives faster than systems designed to manage it. Another unresolved issue involves trust. Throughout the controversy, trust repeatedly collapsed. Relationships that once appeared cooperative became adversarial. People who initially worked together eventually disagreed. Different participants began offering competing accounts. Supporters divided into camps. And once trust disappears, rebuilding it becomes extraordinarily difficult. That reality helps explain why the controversy continues generating interest. Because audiences are still trying to determine which information deserves confidence. Every new statement is evaluated through that lens. Every new claim faces immediate scrutiny. Every explanation is measured against previous explanations. The result is a situation where certainty becomes almost impossible. And perhaps certainty was never available in the first place. Perhaps the story was always more complicated than audiences wanted it to be. Human beings naturally prefer simple narratives. Heroes and villains. Good intentions and bad intentions. Right and wrong. But real life rarely cooperates with those categories. Real life tends to be messy. Motives overlap. People make mistakes. Good intentions produce bad outcomes. Bad decisions create unintended consequences. And complicated situations become even more complicated once thousands of observers begin interpreting them from afar. The Whittaker controversy may ultimately be remembered not because it provided clear answers, but because it resisted them. Another question that continues lingering involves the future of the public conversation itself. How long will interest continue? Some controversies fade quickly. Others become part of internet history. The Whittaker story occupies an unusual position because it involves real people whose circumstances continue evolving. As long as questions remain unanswered, curiosity remains. As long as new information occasionally emerges, discussion continues. As long as participants return to speak, audiences listen. Patrick's recent appearance demonstrated that reality. Months of relative silence were enough to generate significant attention the moment he returned. Not because everyone agreed with him, not because everyone believed him, but because people are still searching for pieces of a puzzle they believe remains incomplete. That search may continue for a long time. Yet perhaps the most important question has nothing to do with Patrick, Eric, commentators, investigators, or internet debates. Perhaps the most important question is whether the family at the center of this story will ever regain ownership of their own narrative. For years, other people have spoken about them, interviewed them, filmed them, analyzed them, defended them, criticized them, advocated for them, argued about them, built content around them, raised money connected to them, investigated events involving them. But through all of it, the family themselves have often seemed increasingly distant from the conversation carrying their name. That may be the deepest irony of the entire story. A controversy about the Whittakers that often becomes more focused on everyone except the Whittakers. Perhaps that is why so many viewers continue following developments. Not because they enjoy drama, not because they enjoy conflict, but because they hope that somewhere beneath the accusations and counter-accusations, the original concern has not been forgotten. The concern for the people whose lives started this conversation in the first place. As Patrick speaks, as other voices respond, as old disagreements resurface, as new claims emerge, That concern remains. And until clearer answers arrive, the questions will continue. What really happened? Who bears responsibility? What lessons should be learned? What comes next? And most importantly, how are the people at the center of the story actually doing today? Those questions remain open. The debate remains active. The opinions remain divided. But one thing is certain. The Whittaker controversy has become much bigger than any single live stream, any single statement, or any single participant. It has become a story about attention, responsibility, trust, and the consequences that follow when private lives become public property. Whether future developments finally provide clarity or simply create new questions remains to be seen. But for now, the story continues. And so does the search for answers. If you've been following this story from the beginning, let us know your thoughts in the comments. What questions do you believe still need answers? What do you think has been misunderstood? And what do you hope happens next for the Whittaker family? Share your perspective below. And if you found this analysis valuable, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss future updates as this story continues to unfold.